Hello, this is the fourth video lecture for the class on Paleys' Watchmaker argument. As I mentioned last time, this argument is a stylistic variant of Aquinas' fifth way. Both of these arguments are considered design style arguments, the idea being that we can recognize the existence of God not from definitions like Anselm, but from the nature of the universe, the amount of order and, for lack of a better word, interworkingness within nature. So we're going to take a look at that in just a second. Before we start, I want to remind you of a couple upcoming due dates. So we have the first rough draft. The rough draft for the first paper is coming due on Friday the 13th, ominously enough. And that's going to be worth 40 points, or 20% of the total paper grade. And you get that full 40 points simply by turning in on time, having it be around the appropriate length, which is 1,000 words, and having it roughly be on topic. And the rough drafts I will comment on, I will send you back that rough draft with comments, and then you'll revise it for the final draft. So please send me something. If you don't get me something, if you just send in a final draft, as sometimes students do, you lose that full 40 points off the paper, and that knocks you down to at best in 80% at best, and that's highly unlikely. Other than the rough draft, so for that, on Saturday, when I post the next VLecture, I'll talk a little bit more about the writing expectations, but you can find lots of information in the syllabus. You can also find a writing guide for philosophy in the file section of Canvas. So if you want to get started on it before Saturday, please read through both of those carefully so that you don't end up way out in left field. Other than that, we have discussion board posts coming due, not until the 15th and 16th, respectively. 15th for the post, 16th for the reply to somebody else's post, and both of those are going to be worth 25 points. There's a total of 8 posts you have to make, 4 posts and 4 replies in the discussion board forums, and they're worth 200 points, so I've just divided it up evenly, mostly for my sake. So please make sure you do that as well. Some people have already posted, and those posts all look fine to me. So continue on in a similar vein as your peers have so far. I'll reply to some, but not all. I want to leave a lot of open posts for you to reply to as well, rather than dominating the discussion board. So that was about it for due dates. Again, if you have any questions about that stuff, the paper or the posts, you can email me. It's easiest to get a hold of me at the Gmail address because it goes through to my phone. I've said this a few times, but you can send it to my college address. You can send it. You can send a message through Canvas as well. It'll just take me a couple days to get it and respond. All right. So for Paleys' Watchmaker argument, he's given us this short story at the beginning of the paper. Imagine yourself walking along, maybe through the woods or something. You're out for your daily stroll or whatever, and you trip over something in the ground. At first you think it's a rock, just a boring old rock, but you notice it's shining. So you bend over, you pick it up and score. It's a Rolex. Someone dropped a Rolex on the ground. Of course your first thought is, wow man, I just got lucky. Somebody lost this Rolex here. You don't think that the Rolex just grew out of the ground on its own. You don't think it just came into existence from a random conflux of atoms and molecules. Both of those seem absurd. Paley, in the Watchmaker argument, he wants us to conclude something similar, but not about the watch, right? The entire thing is a kind of story. It's an analogy to something else, namely the universe, right? So he wants us to think, in fact, when we look out at the universe, we ought to conclude the same thing about it that we would think about the watch. And he just describes the watch to begin with, right? So it's at least at the beginning, it's a little unclear what his argument is. And right after he describes the watch in depth, and he leaves it up to you to make the relevant analogies, he moves on to addressing objections. So let's start by taking a look at his actual argument. Here's how I formulated it from the reading to keep it nice and simple. Hopefully you can see this all right. I'll read it out loud for you. Paleys' Watchmaker argument. Premise 1. We have good reason to believe that a watch was intelligently designed. Seems true. That's just the story of the Rolex, right? You pick it up, you assume that somebody made it, that it's the product of intelligent design. Premise 2, the universe is relevantly similar to a watch. There's a lot built into that. I'll have to come back to that in just a second. and then the conclusion 3. So we have good reason to believe that the universe was intelligently designed. So just 2 premises here, and one is just kind of obviously true. Premise 1 is just obviously true. No one wants to say that watches come together by chance. So all of the interesting objections are going to be to premise 2 here, which asserts that the universe is relevantly similar. And what is it to be relevantly similar? It's just, it's not to be the same, obviously, because the universe just isn't a watch. So there's going to be some differences between the 2. It's, premise 2 here is simply saying that those differences are not important for the argument. They're not important for the conclusion. And so the task here, if you want to object to this argument, and if you want to object to premise 2, is to come up with a difference, a sort of apples and oranges kind of difference, right? So you want to say that there is an important difference, not just any difference, but an important difference between the 2. So if you would like, take a second, pause the video, whatever, think about what that difference could be, maybe write something down. That's what I usually would have students do in the in-person section. Right after this, we're going to look at his objections, 2 objections to his argument. And for those of you who want to start on the philosophy paper early, this is an important model for how philosophers often write. They start out with an argument. They don't spend too long expressing that argument, just long enough so that the reader gets the idea. And then they spend the rest of the paper just responding to objections, right? In that way, it's more like a conversation or a dialogue between different people that you do in order to convince the reader that your thesis is true, right? That your argument is good and that they ought to accept what it is that you're suggesting. All right, but I digress. Okay, on to the objections now. I'm going to skip a few of them for time considerations, but we're going to look at 1, 2, 3, 6, and 8. And if you would like to post a discussion board about 4, 5, or 7, you're more than welcome. Those are the obscure ones, and I think they're also very interesting, but I just don't have time to go off into that. So, number 1 here, he says, nor would it, I apprehend, weaken the conclusion that we had never seen a watch made, that we had never known an artist capable of making one, that we were altogether incapable of executing such a piece of workmanship ourselves, and so on. So here's the objection. You might look at premise 2 and say, look, I got one important difference between a universe and a watch. We've seen watches made. We know humans make watches. We've never seen the universe made. We don't know who made the universe. And on the face of it, it sounds like a good objection. But here's his response. Here's Paleys' response. Well, there's a lot of people who've never seen a watch made. Does that mean that they can't conclude that, in fact, watches are the product of intelligent design? There's all sorts of artifacts that we uncover that we know were made by people, but we don't know how they made them. We don't know how they knew about these things and so forth. But we can still tell that they're the product of intelligent design. And he wants to say the same thing here as a response to this objection that we've never seen the universe made. Right? We don't have to see it made in order to know that it's a product of intelligent design. And then he moves on. So number 2. Neither, secondly, would it invalidate our conclusion that the watch sometimes went wrong or that it seldom went exactly right. The purpose of the machinery, the designer might be evident, and in the case supposed would be evident, in whatever way we accounted for the irregularity of the movement or whether we could account for it or not. It is not necessary that a machine be perfect in order to show with what design it was made. Here's a second objection. 2 big differences between a watch and a universe. The universe sometimes doesn't go so well. Sometimes things don't work out for us so well, right? The watch does a remarkable job of keeping track of time, which is just the revolution of the planet as it orbits the sun. The rotation of the planet as it orbits the sun. The world, though, it's kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes people get cancer and die horribly. Sometimes you have these mass extinction events on the planet Earth. We've gone through 5 of them and we're in the midst of the 6th, right? So you might say, here's one important difference between the 2. The universe has obvious flaws to it. It has obvious problems. And thus we ought to conclude that it's not the work of an intelligent designer. Now his response to this, like the last one, is look, even if we found a watch, even if it turned out the Rolex we picked up didn't keep good track of time, we'd still know it was made by an intelligent designer. Maybe it's got a few flaws here and there, but that doesn't invalidate again the conclusion that it was the product of intelligent design. Let's tab number 2. There is a problem here. Maybe you're picking up on it. that his response really isn't getting at. But I want to come back to that in just a minute. All right, on to number 3. Objection number 3. Nor thirdly would it bring any uncertainty into the argument if there were a few parts of the watch concerning which we could not discover, or had not yet discovered, in what manner they conduced to the general effect, or even some parts concerning which we could not ascertain whether they conduced to that effect in any manner whatsoever. So that's maybe a little confusing, but what he's talking about there is, imagine you pick up your watch, and it's got this knob on it, and you're like, what does this knob do? And no matter how much you turn the knob, no matter what direction you turn it, nothing happens, right? He says, look, it still doesn't mean that the watch just grew there or came about by a random conflux of parts. Likewise for the universe, even if it turns out there are some things that we don't know what they're for, what they do, or maybe they in fact don't do anything at all. Again, he wants to say that doesn't invalidate this conclusion, and doesn't cast adequate doubt on the premise that the universe and the watch are relevantly similar. Again, not the kind of important difference that would make us think that the one is the product of intelligent design, but the other isn't. That was number 3. So superfluous parts. What could be a superfluous part in the universe? Maybe like a benign tumor is superfluous. I don't know. Maybe a cyst. Maybe nipples on males. Who knows? Lots of things, or maybe don't serve any particular point or use. All right, moving on to skipping down to number 6. Oops, gotta change my page. Sixthly, he would be surprised to hear that the mechanism Sixthly, he would be surprised to hear that the mechanism of the watch was no proof of contrivance, only a motive to induce the mind to think so. And I see this objection made a lot, actually, by students. So you take a look at this argument, you read the conclusion there, and it says, so we have good reason to believe. It doesn't say that we know, it doesn't say that it's been proven, it doesn't say that we can be sure. So you might say, look, I'll grant that we have good reason, but we can't be sure. So he says, look, that's absolutely accurate. So that's that's part of what all I'm trying to do here with this argument is show that we have good reason. I'm not trying to prove it. I'm not trying to make it such that we can't even doubt it. And that might sound like a cost on the face of it, but just consider any thesis, any interesting argument we look at in philosophy in this class, almost none of the conclusions will be such that we have proven them beyond any doubt, as we'll see when we get to epistemology. Think about how science works. Even science doesn't prove the truth of a hypothesis or a theory. It only corroborates it, as in lends credence to its truth. It never proves it. Proof doesn't seem to be something that we generally even have access to, except in math, logic, and alcohol, incidentally. So he says, look, it's just, it's not a good objection to simply say that the argument isn't as strong as I would like it to be. It's still strong. It's still giving us good reason to believe something. And lastly, number 8 there, neither lastly would our observer be driven out of his conclusion or from his confidence in its truth by being told that he knew nothing at all about the matter. He knows enough for his argument. He knows the utility of the end. He knows the subserviency and adaptation of the means to the end. These points being known, his ignorance of other points, his doubts concerning other points, affect not the certainty of his reasoning. The consciousness of knowing little need not beget a distrust of that which he does know. So imagine it as an objection here. You say, look, we know lots about watches. We could, in fact, just do a little research, watch some YouTube videos, maybe, whatever, and figure out the sort of parts that are in a watch, the ratio of different, materials in a Rolex, and so forth. But we know very, very little about the universe. And here's our difference. We know so little about the universe. And Paley responds, even if we know so little about the universe, we know enough for this argument, right? Even if a person was imagine you took your Rolex to some country or to some person who's never seen or heard of watches, has no concept of it, maybe doesn't even have a concept of time even, something that extreme, they could still reasonably conclude that that watch was made by someone and perhaps it didn't just grow out of the ground, right? I think that's the idea there, that even if we're massively ignorant about the way the universe works, we have enough for this argument. We can see enough in terms of when we look at nature. But I still haven't fully extrapolated on premise 2 here. Why think, now that we've challenged it, why think it's true, though, that the universe is relevantly similar to the watch. And I expressed this a little bit with the fifth way from Aquinas in the last video lecture. The idea is this: when we look out at the world, we ought to see something, and we ought to recognize. It's difficult to see and it's difficult to recognize, but in fact, it seems like all these systems that we see in the world are incredibly complex systems that require a high degree of precision to function correctly. So consider, for instance, your body. This is the common example made by people who endorse intelligent design theories. You're made out of, as an adult, somewhere around 37 trillion cells. You have something like 3 billion base pairs in your DNA. You are this incredibly complex organism. You can't just take out an organ and continue functioning. They all work together with a high degree of precision. So much so that you are vastly more complex than any watch conceived or made, right? Vastly more complex, inconceivably more. And that's just you, a single organism. Then we look out at the world. We see, in fact, for instance, that the Earth has this perfect distance from the sun for there to be water in 3 forms. We see, in fact, that we have this atmosphere which helps distribute heat around the globe so that certain regions don't get too hot or too cold, and that the oceans do something likewise. We see this vegetative matter that sequesters or takes in carbon dioxide and gives off oxygen that we need to breathe while we give off the carbon dioxide that the plants take in. We see this ozone layer, O3, which blocks out harmful UV radiation. We see the electromagnetic field, which blocks radiation as well and really allows there to be terrestrial life on Earth. I could just go on and on about all these different systems in nature and how incredibly interrelated they are and how incredibly structured and orderly they act, as Aquinas would put it, so as to produce the best end, or almost always the best end. And then it would be astonishing, surprising, if we were to conclude that this was merely a matter of luck rather than the result of the intelligent design of a being such as God. Now, objections to that. And in fact, there are some pretty strong objections to this argument. I want to leave most of them up to you for your discussion board posts and your papers and so forth, but here are the 2 common conjoint objections that historically really acted to undermine this argument. So they go by way of the name the weak anthropic principle and the realization concerning both how large the universe is and how old it is. So let me explain both of these things as best I can here in what little time I have. The weak anthropic principle just says, look, given that you're alive, what are the chances that the conditions would be just right for life to arise where you are at, right, here on Earth? What are the chances that things would be necessary for there to be life, given that you are alive? Well, they're actually really high. In fact, it's 1. That's the chance. You have to, or I should put it like this, anywhere in the universe where life arises, therein is going to be a place that permits there to be life, right? So you don't have life just popping up in the void of space. You don't have life popping up on planets like Mercury that are inhospitable to life. So life shouldn't be surprised. Living things shouldn't be surprised to find themselves with just the right conditions for life, such as being the right distance from the sun and so forth, right? Secondly, the universe is actually really old. And our planet's really old. It's 4.6 billion years old, and our universe is around 12 billion years old. That's a lot of time. Moreover, the universe is huge. It's huge. So so here we are on this planet orbiting a star, the Earth. The Earth is like a speck of dust around the sun, really. It really is like a speck of dust in our solar system. And then our solar system is one of billions of solar systems, right? One of billions of stars. The sun is one of billions of stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, which is a spiral galaxy. And last I heard, there's something around 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, around 2 trillion, each of which can contain billions of stars. That's a lot of places where you can have planets with life-permitting conditions. A lot of places. And you have a lot of time for that to happen. And the weak anthropic principle simply tells us that wherever life pops up, the conditions are going to be just right for life. The conjunction of these two principles entails that we ought not be surprised by how incredibly well everything works around us, how remarkably intricate, in fact, we see nature to be, because it's had a long time to evolve this way. And that's therein the concept of biological evolution and stellar evolution and its understanding of cosmology and where we fit into the matter, sort of. we develop this naturalistic explanation for why we see what we do that doesn't require us to posit an intelligent designer. And thus, this was probably the most devastating argument to the older design style arguments. In the next video lecture, we'll take a look at a newer design style argument that on the face of it seems to evade this objection. It's called the fine-tuning argument. There's no reading for that. There is an optional reading. You can take a look at it if you want. I think it's optional reading 3.5 or something. It's supposed to come after reading 3 but before 4. But it's an optional reading because it was just too complex, I think, for an intro-level course. So really all you'll need to do for the next video lecture is watch, or for the next class session is just watch the video lecture. Oh, I did mention that there was something going on in number 2 here, this notion that the universe isn't perfect or has flaws. And that ties back into the idea that the theistic God, the kind of God that we've been talking about, and the kind that many classical theists want to prove exists, is sometimes called an omnimax God. They're all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. Now, Paleys' response that the universe isn't perfect and has flaws, and that's okay, that doesn't undermine intelligent design, that seems reasonable, provided that God is not the sort of being who's perfect and can't make flawed products. So we might say, look, Paley, your response to number 2, maybe it saves some kind of belief in God, some imperfect God, maybe even the God of deism or something like that. But it doesn't get the theists what they want, namely that we ought to believe, for instance, that the universe is intelligently designed by a perfect being, the sort of being who wouldn't, create a universe that seems to have these massive flaws like cancer and starvation and so forth. We'll see more about that when we get to the problem of evil here in a while. All right, that was it for today, and I hope to see you. I guess I will see, or you'll see me for the next video lecture on Saturday. I'll talk again more about the upcoming rough draft that's due in the writing guide. Have a good 4th.